So this next edition of recommendations from my shelf, I wanted to actually recommend not just one book, but actually an entire author. And it's pretty rare that I'll do this, as most people write very different stories over time. But I think that for this particular author and his influence on me, it makes more sense to actually recommend him as a whole and let people find a book that really meets what they're looking for. If you've gone on my website and read my About Me page, I'm sure you've seen his name. I try and mention it as often as I can because he was very influential to me as a young reader. And that author is John Bellairs. Now, this book is The Secret of the Underground Room. And the reason I picked this one, even though it's not necessarily my favorite, is because it has the original Edward Gorey covers. The Edward Gorey covers are spectacular. And if you can find any that have that, those are the ones you want. Obviously, there are different editions. This is the Chessman of Doom, which is a personal, real favorite of mine. And this cover isn't quite the same as the cool, exciting, and dangerous illustrations that Edward Gorey did. You can also find this one. This is probably the easiest one to find because it has The House with a Clock in its Walls, but it has two other stories. The House with the Clock in its Walls is his most popular work. It's his most well-known. And it's the one that they keep perpetually making into a movie every so often that ends up being terrible and not matching any of what he did, unfortunately, despite the fact that his material is ripe for very engaging content, especially for kids. So, for instance, here's another example. He actually has, in some of the books, you'll actually find Edward Gorey illustrations throughout, which is a real treat. Edward Gorey was a very famous horror illustrator, and the way that he did these covers, is just exceptional. The mystery, the intrigue, the excitement. There's a few others I have that are of his covers, and every time I find one in that cover, I try and buy it because it's the best version. Now, who is John Bellairs, and what are these books? So John Bellairs mainly wrote adventure fiction for a category that is now dubbed young adult. But the difference is that his books didn't really feel like they talked down to you. I remember I came across them because at the time I would go to my local library often, and I struggled to find books that really engaged me, but I really wanted to read. I loved pawing through libraries. I loved getting different books. And it was really hard for me to find one that just gripped me. And what ended up happening was I went to my librarian and I asked her somewhere, between either 5th or 8th grade, I can't remember. And I asked her, I was looking for something that had, mystery and adventure and excitement and intrigue. And I didn't know, I wanted something really compelling that spoke to me as a young boy. And I remember she recommended me, it was actually this book here, The Chessman of Doom. She had said that I would probably like these because they really appealed to young boys who wanted adventure. And this story is actually about a professor and a young boy who are, he's friends with him and his other friend, and they go stay at this deserted estate to inherit it. And there ends up being a mystery they have to unravel that involves someone who has plans to, unleash this power on the world. And all of the stories tend to kind of have this creepy horror supernatural vibe. It's not like, the Hardy Boys or anything like that, where they're sort of just these typical little, run-of-the-mill mysteries involving noises in a cave. These are, they involve ghosts, they involve the supernatural, they involve riddles with, different elements of fantasy and horror. It really is, in my opinion, the birth of the YA genre itself. Unfortunately, he doesn't really get credit for any of the influence he had, even though I probably have a feeling R.L. Stine read a few of these books because of how they are these specific adventures that get completed in this one volume. And that's something that was very influential on me, is that he wrote these books that are engaging. They're only, this one's like 140 pages, but it feels like a very complete story. There's nothing, left to the imagination or meat on the bone, if you will, the term I like using. But these books are very quick and digestible. And if you have a young reader that you really want to get into sort of fantasy or different speculative fiction, and you want them to read something that is going to be not talking down to them, but is still at their reading level, but that is going to get them to get sucked in and want to read more like this, these are the right books. These are great books. I haven't read them in years though, so obviously some of the different references will be a bit dated, but I think it's fun for a young reader. And I know even for me, a lot of the stuff in here is based on like the 1950s. But I never found that as a barrier, even as a young kid. It made me more engaged. It almost made again, sort of this feeling of being familiar, but yet far away. There's just a sense of exploration and adventure that is captured in these that is really hard to do. Outside of Harry Potter, I would say that young reader books, this and Harry Potter are the two young reader books that I read that really captured the imagination of being a young kid who goes somewhere that feels totally accessible and ends up growing up and escaping into this, exciting way of life. I guess also C.S. Lewis's Lion, Witch, of the Wardrobe would be another one like that, since I have read a few of those books as well. But yes, if you're looking for almost like a kid's pulp book, surprisingly, these are it. I mean, you have all these different adventures. I have a ton of these books. I have almost every single one. I eventually want to track them all down, and it's been sort of a fun little mission for me when I go to used bookstores to try and get them all. And that's sort of the caveat, is that these books really aren't in print. You may find a few out there. There are sort of three central characters that he uses. There's these ones that involve Professor Childermass and Johnny Dixon. There's another one involving Anthony Munday, and then the characters from the House of the Clock in its Walls. The young boy and girl that are friends in this one. Those are sort of the three different characters, and he uses them throughout his books in solo standalone adventures, basically young kids pulp books, which is really, really cool. And they even have the illustrations too, which totally matches the formatting of pulp books. So if you're looking for reads that they can get into, you just have to go track them down either online or at used bookstores. But a lot of people don't know about these books or how good they are, so they sit on shelves for a long time. And if your used bookstore hasn't been totally picked over, you'll probably find at least two or three, and they're probably so cheap. I mean, I don't know of anyone who's paid more than a couple bucks for one at a used bookstore. It's sad that someone hasn't taken this and made some really masterful collections, because whether it's a series of unfortunate events or Harry Potter or Goosebumps or heck, even Space Brat, I remember that book. Most of those books have come out of the shell of what this book created, or this series of books created, and no one ever talks about John Bellairs, and it's kind of heartbreaking to me, because when you read these books, if you do, you'll totally understand what I mean about how he really set the tone for what young fiction could really do. I mean, him and obviously C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis, it was a very more sweet and safe story. These are dangerous and horror-centric and ghosts, and if you have a kid who wants a cool, scary story chapter book, nothing is better than these. I would actually say that if you want a really good one for young readers who want that suspense and mystery, I would say The Lamp from the Warlock's Tomb or The Curse of the Blue Figurine are the two that I would probably recommend, followed by The Chessman of Doom. Those would be the three that I would say you'd probably want to start out with and hunt down, because they're just so engaging and exciting. As far as influences into my work, aside from what I've already mentioned, or at least to summarize it all, I would say that the big thing that he showed me was how the pulps were formatted. I mean, when you look at these, and then when I eventually read the Elric books, I was like, wow, these books are really like pulp books for kids. It's kind of crazy. And the ability to have characters that continue on in self-contained stories that stand alone, but yet these characters keep progressing into these new stories with a bunch of illustrations inside, that's exactly what I did in my books. I mean, I have, illustrations throughout my stories myself. This is a specific one here of the guy you see behind me. So I put, multiple, make sure you can see that there, multiple illustrations inside my own books. For instance, I had one of the library setting, which is very influential from his books. So if you can see sort of this library here, I loved that in his books he had, like I showed you earlier, these settings with these characters. I'll show it again just for reference, but you know, as you can see here, how influential that was on me as a young reader to open a book that's a chapter book that had an illustration that looked that freaking cool. It really weighed heavily on me. And so as I got older and read all these books and eventually grew out of them in a sense, I always longed for books that captured me in that way. And honestly, it's been very hard to find. The void left of finishing all of John Bellairs' books has been massive, and I don't know if it's ever really been filled, because very few authors have the prolific amount of content that he had that remained engaging and intriguing, even to the point where the books that were finished by Brad Strickland after John Bellairs' passing still measure up just as well and follow the narrative just as strong. They still hit all of those beats of being a quick, fast-paced read that is a standalone, exciting adventure that you can't put down, and as soon as you do, you just want to pick up and read another one. I mean, it really is the binge reading of book content. I would say that if you are looking for an exciting, accessible, easy to read binge read, and even if you're older, I would recommend these. I think that they're fantastic and you won't be disappointed. And if you have a young reader in your life, or you are a young reader, try and track these down, because you won't be disappointed. As long as you can handle some of the dated referencing and lifestyles of it being an older period. But I mean, most of the fantasy we read is pretending to be in the Middle Ages. You know, it's not like they're wholly realistic or of our time period anyways. And it's also fun to read books like this where you don't feel trapped into all the modern conveniences. I think even in a lot of books, they try and find ways to match the communication styles we have now. For instance, instant communication. There seems to be a lot of, fantasy that involves that, where it's like, well, people can text now. I have to have something relatable, and we have these devices that I've been guilty of that myself in some instances. But I would say that this is a wholly of its time period. It doesn't get caught into any of trying to be modern in any way, obviously because they were written a long time ago, but they really do specifically stay within that period. And it's better for it because the mystery and intrigue remains in the fact that you're in a time period that feels like these adventures would happen. It feels like there's a possibility. So in conclusion, I would say that if you're looking for something that is for a young reader, that's exciting and fascinating, that's fast-paced, that's got some horror tones to it, that is an adventure, a kid's Indiana Jones, if you will, but with a horror bent, these are the books for those young readers. Or if you're an older reader and you know, similar to how older readers would jump into Harry Potter because they just wanted something fun and easy, if you want something fun and easy, but that has sort of an edge to it and is a bit more gritty, and there's a bit more stakes, and it feels like anything could happen, and there's a lot of supernatural elements to it that have that horror edge, I would recommend these books as well. I would say that if you can find them, I would start with either the Chessman of Doom, the Lamp from the Warlock's Tomb, or the Curse of the Blue Figurine. Either of those three are the way to go. And if you end up reading them, please tell me about it. I don't often say this in my videos, but please comment if you've read these books. Tell me about it, because I've had a really hard time finding other people who have read John Bellairs' work. And again, like I said, it's kind of sad that these books have sort of lost their way, and the only way to read them was at libraries, and most libraries haven't held on to them. So if you've read these books or you're planning on reading these books, please let me know about it, because this author is the most influential author to me in my life, and it means a lot to get to share him with you. So again, another recommendation off of my shelf is any book by John Bellairs.